It was Christmas Eve, a night that was always meant for warmth, for laughter, and for love. The soft glow of twinkling lights, the rich smell of roasted turkey, the sound of family gathered around the table. That's how it used to be. That's the memory I held on to. But this year, the air was cold, not because of the winter frost outside, but because of the chill in my own daughter's words. "Dad," she said, her voice sharp with a dismissive tone. "I'd unfortunately grown used to. You didn't contribute. So maybe you shouldn't eat tonight." The room went silent. Utterly still. Forks froze midair. My wife's hand, which was reaching for the gravy, stopped. I could feel everyone's eyes on me. My own hands, resting on my lap, began to tremble slightly. It wasn't from hunger or the cold. It was from the shock, the sheer disbelief of what I had just heard. My daughter, my little girl, the same one I once carried on my shoulders through the park, the same one whose scraped knees I'd carefully bandaged, was now looking at me as if I was a freeloader, a burden, a non-contributor. I tried to manage a smile, a faint one, desperately trying to keep the hurt from showing on my face. "Didn't contribute?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Sweetheart, But she cut me off before I could even finish. "Dad, please. We're all tired of the guilt trips. You don't help with anything around here. You don't pay bills. Just let us enjoy our evening, okay?" Her husband, my son-in-law, shifted uncomfortably in his seat and looked away, suddenly fascinated by the pattern on his plate. My grandkids, sweet kids, who didn't understand just stared awkwardly, their joyful holiday mood evaporating into the tense air. No one said a word. Not my wife, not my other children. Nothing. The only sound that filled the heavy silence was the clinking of silverware against porcelain as a few people cautiously resumed eating. Inside, something in me didn't just break. It shattered. Quietly, completely, and irreparably. But I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply nodded, a slow, deliberate motion. My old legs felt unsteady as I pushed my chair back and stood up, leaving the table I had helped pay for, and the house I had helped them buy. Years of raising a family, of navigating conflicts and heartaches, teaches you one thing. Silence, sometimes, is the most powerful response. I walked to the small guest room at the back of the house, closed the door, and sat on the edge of the bed in the darkness. The sound of their laughter, distant and muffled, echoed faintly through the walls. It sounded hollow, and as I sat there, alone, my mind became a movie screen, replaying everything I had done to bring my family to this point. I remembered every sacrifice, every sleepless night when the kids were sick. I remembered taking on extra shifts at the factory, my body aching, especially after my wife had her health scare and couldn't work. I had poured my entire life, my youth, my strength into building this family, and to giving them a foundation I never had. I had given everything, and now, on Christmas Eve, I was being denied a plate of food at my own daughter's table. They saw me as weak. They saw me as a relic, a forgotten old man whose purpose was fulfilled. But they didn't know one crucial thing about me. I don't break. I bend, but I don't break. That night, I didn't shed a single tear. I didn't waste my energy on curses or anger. Instead, a strange sense of clarity washed over me. When someone betrays your love that deeply, it's not rage that drives you. It's focus. You stop seeing people through the fuzzy lens of family or friends. You start seeing them for who they've truly become. Users, manipulators, ungrateful souls who have been so blinded by comfort that they can no longer see the hands that provided it. I had given my daughter more than she could ever repay. I paid for her entire university education so she could start her life debt-free. I bought her first car, a reliable little thing to get her to her first job safely. I co-signed and helped with the down payment on this very house she was now trying to banish me from. And yet, she had the audacity, the sheer nerve, to look me in the eye and tell me I hadn't contributed. Well, a new thought began to form in my mind. If contribution was the currency that defined value in her world, then maybe, just maybe, it was time she learned exactly what it felt like to live without mine. That night, while they ate and celebrated an open presents, I made a quiet, firm decision. I wasn't going to be the poor old dad sitting silently in the corner, waiting for scraps of affection. I wasn't going to beg for a seat at a table I built with my own 2 hands. No. I was going to take it all back. My revenge wouldn't be loud or explosive. It wouldn't be cruel. It would be poetic. It would be a lesson in consequences. Because sometimes, karma doesn't arrive with thunder and lightning. Sometimes, it comes quietly, methodically, dressed in the simple, elegant robes of justice. They thought they could strip me of my dignity, but they had forgotten just how much power I still held. The small business I'd started years before retirement. The one I still held majority shares in. The properties I'd invested in all still legally in my name. They were all under my control. My daughter and her husband had been living under the comfortable assumption that they had inherited everything already, that my assets were their assets. What she didn't realize was that a will is just a piece of paper until it is signed, sealed, and delivered by a lawyer after you're gone. And I was very much still here. So, sitting there in the dark, I smiled. It was the kind of smile that hides a coming storm. Because next Christmas, things were going to be very, very different. I wasn't planning to hurt her, not in a malicious way. I wasn't planning to destroy her life. I was planning to teach her the one lesson I thought I had instilled in her years ago. That respect is undemanded by money or status. It is earned through love, kindness, and gratitude. And since she had clearly forgotten that lesson, I would have to provide a refresher course she would never, ever forget. When I was done, when the tables had finally and irrevocably turned, she would understand exactly what kind of nothing her old man really was. Because sometimes, the man you underestimate the most is the one who's been quietly writing your ending all along. The story was just beginning. The morning after that, cold, humiliating Christmas Eve, I woke before the sun. My back ached as I sat on the edge of that narrow guest bed, but my mind was sharper than it had been in years. You see, pain has a strange way of awakening you. It strips away all the noise and shows you what truly matters. I looked around that tiny room. It used to be my workshop, now converted into a guest corner for when Dad visits. There was nothing left of me in that house. The photos on the wall, the laughter, the warmth all gone, replaced by my daughter's modern decorations and her husband's expensive tastes. The smell of breakfast drifted up from downstairs. I could hear them chatting, their voices full of life, their plates full of food, as if last night had never happened. For them, it probably hadn't. For me, though, it was unforgettable. I stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the snow-covered backyard. It used to be my pride, every tree planted by my own hands, every corner tended with care. My wife and I built it together when times were hard, but our hearts were strong. She passed away 5 years ago, and since then, I'd felt the world grow colder, but I never imagined the frost would come from within my own blood. Still, I wasn't the kind of man to crumble. No, I was the kind of man who learned early that life only rewards those who think ahead, and I had thought ahead. 4 months before that Christmas, I'd begun moving things around: assets, properties, shares, all quietly, all legally. My daughter believed she was the heir to my success, that everything I owned would naturally pass to her and her picture-perfect family. What I didn't know was that I had already changed my will once. And just like that night years ago, when I built our home from nothing, I had a new plan. That morning, I packed my old leather bag, folded my few clothes, and walked out of the house without saying goodbye. My daughter saw me from the kitchen window. She didn't even come out. Maybe she thought I was overreacting. Maybe she thought I'd come back once my pride had cooled, but I didn't look back. As I stepped into the biting cold, I made a promise to myself. This wasn't about vengeance born of hatred, but about justice born of pain. A week later, I was back in the small countryside town where my journey began. It was the same town where I'd worked my hands to the bone, building a small farming empire from scratch. I met with my old friend Harold, a lawyer who'd handled my business affairs for years. He greeted me warmly. "Well, if it isn't the legend himself, what brings you here, old friend?" I managed a faint smile. "Harold, I think it's time we rewrite a few things." He raised an eyebrow. "The will," I nodded, "and everything attached to it." I explained what had happened, how my daughter had humiliated me, how she saw me as a useless old man, how I was denied food in the very home I paid for. Harold's expression hardened with every word. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and said softly, "You always were too kind, Robert." Maybe it is time she learns what kindness taken for granted looks like when it has gone, and that was exactly what I planned to show her. Over the next few weeks, we worked quietly, but thoroughly. I had assets spread across different accounts, some under old partnerships, some in investments my daughter had no idea even existed. I changed the beneficiary of every single one, not to her, but to someone who understood loyalty. There was a young man named Eric who used to work for me years ago. He'd been like a son to me, hardworking, honest, and respectful. When his own father passed away, I helped him through college, helped him buy his first farm. He'd never forgotten what I did for him. When I called him and told him I needed his help, he didn't hesitate for a second. "Mr. Robert," he said, his voice full of concern, "you gave me a future. I'll do anything you need." That's the difference between blood and loyalty. One might share your name, but the other shares your soul. We began transferring shares and deeds under my company to Eric's management. It was all done quietly, smartly. On paper, it looked like nothing more than a standard business reality. In reality, it was the first step in reclaiming my dignity. Meanwhile, my daughter would call occasionally. Her calls were out of obligation, not love. Her tone was always clipped, impatient. "Dad, are you okay? You haven't been home." "I'm fine," I'd reply calmly, "just sorting out a few old things." She had no idea that those old things were the very foundation of the life she took for granted. And soon, she was about to find out just how much they were worth. "Don't overdo it," she'd sigh, talking to me like I was a child. "You should rest. Rest." That's what she thought I should do. Just fade away quietly, without being a burden to her and her perfect life. But I wasn't resting. I was rebuilding. Then Came the spring. While my daughter was busy posting pictures of her luxury vacations online, I was back on the land I once owned, working side by side with my old friend Eric. The soil still felt the same beneath my fingers, and the air still carried that rich, earthy scent of purpose. The more time I spent away from her world of superficial wealth, the clearer everything became. They say money changes people, but I think entitlement destroys them. She'd completely forgotten where she came from. She'd forgotten who paid for her education, who guaranteed her comfort, who ensured her safety all these years. And the cruelest irony of all, she thought I had nothing left to give. But the truth was, I was about to take back everything I had ever given her. Not through anger, but through justice. Every document I signed, every transfer I approved, every single line of my new will was a silent echo of the pain she caused me. But unlike her cruelty, my actions had a purpose. This wasn't about watching her suffer. It was about making her finally understand what she had truly lost when she lost me. Months later, an invitation arrived, a grand party to celebrate her husband's promotion. They invited me, of course, out of some cold sense of courtesy. Part of me wanted to just throw it away, but another part, the part that had been broken that Christmas night, knew I had to go. Not to see them, not to talk, but simply to watch. When I arrived, the house was overflowing with guests. Sweet laughter with a glittering display of wealth. My daughter looked radiant, dressed in gold and practiced smiles. She hugged me briefly, awkwardly, like she was posing for a photograph she didn't want to be in. "Glad you could come, Dad," she said, her voice polished and distant. I smiled faintly. Wouldn't miss it. She had no idea what was coming. Non è at all. That night, I stood there in silence, just looking around at everything she thought was hers. The chandeliers, the expensive art, the very house itself, all built on the money I had earned through a lifetime of hard work. And in that moment, I realized something powerful. She hadn't just taken my food that Christmas. She had taken my respect, my place in the family, my worth as her father. But soon, very soon, she would learn that everything she believed she owned was built on a foundation that I laid, and I had already started taking the bricks back, one by one. The best part? She wouldn't even see it coming, because real revenge doesn't come with fire and fury. It comes quietly, wrapped in paperwork. When I left that party, I found myself walking slower than I used to. It wasn't from fatigue. The world around me just felt different, thinner, like a painted backdrop that people step behind when they get tired of pretending. The laughter still buzzed behind the curtains of that house, but from the road, the lights looked cold and empty. I thought of my late wife's laugh, the way it used to fill every small corner of our first home. It was a sound that never needed an audience, never needed applause. The days that followed were quiet on the surface, but seismic underneath. I continued my steady work with Eric. We were mending fences, measuring foundations, meeting suppliers, the kind of tasks that build real, tangible things. The farm responded to hands that knew its language. The new crops seemed to lean toward us, like old friends. And while I was there, real life, the honest kind, kept happening. The world that I once thought revolved around my daughter's carefully curated life was continuing on just fine without her. That was the thing she would never understand. The universe doesn't stop just because you've been cruel. Cruelty is loud, but consistency is louder. and consistency always outlasts a moment of spite. Then, the first letter came. It wasn't a dramatic lawsuit or a demand for an explanation. It was a small, bureaucratic note from a bank in another town. A note that would mean nothing to anyone else. Decades ago, my wife and I had opened a legacy account, and a dormant trust clause had just been activated by my recent legal changes. The account wasn't huge, but it was legally significant. The funds were earmarked for community stewardship, and the terms required a demonstrated contribution and a declared intent from me to control them. The bank was notifying me that the account would be activated upon my direction. It was a single candle, small and private, but it was about to start casting some very long shadows. I sat on my porch with that letter for a long time, just watching the horizon. The temptation to gloat was real. It would have been so easy to drive back to that house and shout, to reveal everything like an actor delivering the final monologue of a play. But I had never built my life around the applause of strangers. My life was built on the slow, stubborn accumulation of trust, skill, and honor. I folded the letter back up, like tucking away a tool to be used later, and went back to work. A true maker, a true builder, keeps his triumphs in the workshop until the entire structure is sound. And my work was just beginning. Weeks blurred into months. Back in her house, my daughter's world began to wobble in small, private ways. It started subtly. A contractor called about overdue invoices for a kitchen renovation she decommissioned in a rush of vanity. Then a supplier refused to extend their credit line because payments were late. Little things. You know, the kind most people just dismiss as a string of bad luck. But they started to cluster around her life, like clouds before a storm. Her social calendar, once so glitzy and precise, started sliding into a series of cancellations. At first, she blamed the economy. Then it was bad timing. And then, it was always me. It was just easier to point a finger at an old man than to look at her own choices. She started getting careless in ways she never had before. A damning receipt left in a purse, a contract signed without reading the fine print. Pride makes people sloppy. Entitlement makes them reckless. And arrogance, well, arrogance doesn't just stop at being cruel. It eventually trips over its own feet. What my daughter couldn't see, from the center of her carefully lit, perfect rooms, was the quiet legal architecture I had set in motion years ago. It wasn't some big, dramatic Hollywood moment. It was just a set of decisions and documents, signed long ago and activated right now. I had reallocated the title to a primary parcel of land of Veryland their mortgage had used as collateral. I moved it into a stewardship trust, designed to provide community housing and emergency funds for the county. Legally, they could still live on the land, but practically, if the management and upkeep were neglected, the trust was legally obligated to step in and preserve the asset for the public good. When the lender noticed this subtle shift in the title, they froze certain lines of credit tied to the property. That's how these things happen quietly, in the background. One note, one clause. And suddenly, what had been a guarantee for lavish weekend trips became a live obligation requiring constant oversight. You can't build a life on borrowed guarantees. Sooner or later, the bank calls the architect. The first real sign that their illusion of permanence was cracking came on a Tuesday morning. The mail carrier left a notice on their door, an upcoming inspection by the county for septic maintenance. It was mundane, just a bureaucratic pebble, but it was the kind of pebble that grows into a mountain if you ignore it. Melissa saw it and just scoffed at the inconvenience. But the inspection required funds for repairs. Funds that, for the first time in a very long time, weren't flowing as freely as they used to. That week, she called me. Her voice was strained, not the polished, confident lilt I'd grown used to. "Dad," she said, "can you come over? We need help with the inspection." She didn't ask with her old sense of entitlement. For the first time, I heard fear at the edge of her words. Of course, I agreed. I was still their father, and I have always been a man who fixes things. It's a fundamental truth. When your foundation is weak, even the smallest inspection becomes a reckoning. When I got to the house, the look on my son-in-law Daniel's face wasn't one of blame, but of pure exhaustion. They were drowning, trying to catch up on 100 small bills that had accumulated into a single, monstrous weight. He'd been humbled by the boardroom, by the hard realities of business decisions he thought he understood. Standing shoulder to shoulder with him under a low attic light, I helped him haul out an old toolbox. We went through the list of repairs together, fixing a leaky pipe, working with his hands, sweat in his eyes. It seemed to make him younger, not because of nostalgia, but because it reconnected him to the man who had taught him how to measure a beam, how to sweat for the things that truly matter. He muttered apologies between tightening bolts and fitting pipes, the kind of apologies that come from learning, not from pleading. Humility often smells like oil and dust, and it's the only perfume that lasts. While we repaired water damage and replaced a rotten beam, I continued my quiet work on the administrative side. People sometimes ask me how you can be loving and legal at the same time. The answer is simple. The same honesty that stops a leak is the honesty that stops a lie. Decisions that seem cold on paper can warm into something that rescues people, especially when they're built to protect the vulnerable from themselves. The trust I established wasn't meant to be punitive. It was meant to be prescriptive. It required them to participate in stewardship programs, to log a minimum number of volunteer hours, and to engage with their community to receive any significant funds. It was a framework that gave them a way back, a path to redemption if they chose to take it. I'm not going to lie. There were nights I lay awake, thinking about the look on Melissa's face when she would finally realize how all the legal strings had been tied. But I also thought about the look on my grandson's face when Eddie finally sees Mother hand a plate of food to a neighbor in need. That was the kind of sight I wanted to create in the world. You don't punish people with paperwork. You guide them with a structure that asks for something better. You show them that the greatest wealth isn't what you own, but what you contribute. And sometimes, the only way to help someone find their footing is to gently, lovingly, remove the ground from beneath their feet. The news about the trust's reallocation spread far beyond our home. The local paper picked it up, and soon a reporter was writing about an elderly man who had redirected his family's assets to community projects. At first, they framed it as eccentric, but then the tone shifted to thoughtful as neighbors began sharing stories of my past generosity to veterans and children. The online chatter that had fueled our family disputes quieted down once people saw the fund feeding soup kitchens and sponsoring after-school programs. Suddenly, Claire's curated outrage looked shallow when compared to the shared community benefit. She reacted the way people do when the ground shifts beneath them. First with fury, then with frantic maneuvering. She hired a lawyer, sending a storm of formal letters questioning the validity of the transfers. Her legal team argued for her convenience, her entitlement. My lawyers, who were also teachers of law and understood the town's unique moral compass, simply pointed to the signed documents, the signatures, the clear intent laid out years before. When the judge asked if the legal instruments were clear, the answer was a simple yes. The law might be blind to moral drama, but that blindness also allows it to see the truth written on paper. Paperwork, you see, is a quiet kind of thunder. It doesn't roar, but it will change the weather. In the weeks that followed, relationships frayed. Friends who once texted about brunch stopped calling, spooked by tabloid questions about ventures that now seemed risky. Melissa's social media feeds went silent. Her husband lost clients who were wary of being associated with a family in a public dispute. That's the thing about entitlement. It needs a crowd to feel big. Take away the audience, and the emperor is left standing alone. I watched from a distance as her world contracted. There was a hardness in it that eventually cracked and gave way to something else. Reflection. I don't admire suffering, but sometimes necessary discomfort is what sparks growth, and growth, after all, was the entire point. If they were to inherit anything that truly mattered, it needed to be the capacity to care. Money without compassion is just paper pretending to have value. Then, something I never expected happened. It was the real turning point. Melissa, begrudgingly at first, started showing up at one of the shelters our fund supported. Not for a photo op, not as a PR stunt, but early in the morning, hauling donated blankets. She looked awkward and raw, a far cry from her usual polished and strategic self. Her hands were clumsy with the work, but she stayed. I remember the first time I saw her there, bent over a stack of donated coats with her sleeves rolled up. It was the same posture I'd held for decades when I helped move furniture for the community center. But this time her posture wasn't for show, it was for learning. She avoided my eyes at first, but then she finally looked up. When our gazes met, I saw something entirely new in her face. A beginning. The sweetest victories are the ones that end not in someone's ruin, but in their transformation. When she got home that evening, quieter than she had been in months, Daniel asked her how it was. She hesitated for a moment, then said, tiring, but honest. My son closed his eyes, his own resolve beginning to take a different shape. He started volunteering himself, not because the trust required it, but because he had seen his own son ask why a man had been turned away from a warm meal the week before. In that moment, compassion finally woke up in him. I never reveled in their collapse. I wanted them to learn a lesson, yes, but I never wanted to ruin them. I wanted them to own their choices and, eventually, to choose differently. The trust was just a lever, a way to pivot from a life of consumption to one of contribution. And slowly, painfully, they began to turn. A clever plan is one thing, but a kind heart is what makes it all worthwhile. There were still nights filled with anger. Melissa would pace her room, screaming into pillows. Accusations were flung around like knives. Daniel sometimes came home drunk on guilt, muttering apologies. But amidst the chaos, small, meaningful acts began to multiply. A neighbor was helped. A school teacher wrote to my daughter to thank her for sponsoring a scholarship. My grandson proudly pointed to a plaque with our family name at the community center and said to his mother, "Isn't Grandpa proud?" She just nodded and wiped her eyes, the hard lines of arrogance on her face finally softening. When the court officially dismissed the frivolous claims against the trust, validating the stewardship clause, not as a punishment, but as a responsible mechanism, it felt like the entire house took a collective breath of relief. The life that had been built on entitlement was finally adjusting its sails. I sat on my bench that day with a cup of coffee, listening to the wind whistle through the barn rafters. It felt like the world was righting itself. Justice isn't always dramatic. Sometimes, it's just the slow, steady sorting of right from wrong. Months later, at a harvest dinner hosted by one of the charities, they stood by my side. They weren't polished for cameras. They were just there, their hands showing the signs of work, their smiles carrying both an apology and the beginning of a new understanding. We all ate warm soup together. My grandson clapped during a toast, and then my daughter raised her glass, her voice small but true, and mouthed the two words I had wanted to hear since that fateful Christmas Eve. I am sorry. I didn't need to go up to the podium. The applause that night wasn't for a victory over a person, but for the village we had rebuilt when our family remembered how to be a family. When those who love forget your worth, teach them to remember with an invitation to change, not a desire to break them. It's been a full year since that Christmas Eve when I sat freezing in a corner, starving in a house I once built with my own two hands. The same frost covers the streets now, but this time it doesn't touch me. Instead, It's her world, my daughter's world, that has begun to freeze. At first, the cracks were tiny, too small for her to even notice. A supplier refused to extend her credit. A business loan renewal was mysteriously delayed. Her husband's company cut their bonuses, citing budget restructuring. She just brushed it all off, the way people living in denial often do. She had spent too long believing that her comfort was permanent, that her success was all her own doing, completely untouched by the sacrifices that came before her. But here's the thing. When you build your castle on someone else's foundation, you forget that the ground beneath you can shift. And I was that ground. When you forget your roots, don't be surprised when the soil stops holding you up. The first real blow came in a thick envelope, a letter from an attorney's office. Inside, the news was cold and simple. The company shares she thought she controlled had been transferred. The family estate, the very house she so proudly flaunted, was no longer solely in her name. It was now a part of a legacy trust, with community oversight. I had spent months preparing this. Everything was done legally, quietly, and perfectly within my rights. Every document had my signature, my intention, and a witness. This wasn't about revenge through destruction. It was about correction. It was a way to ensure that the wealth I'd worked my entire life for would never again be used as a weapon against someone else's dignity. You see, revenge doesn't always come with fire. Sometimes it comes with a fountain pen. She called me that same night. Her voice was trembling, a cocktail of rage and disbelief. "Dad," she snapped. "What have you done? The lawyer says you've changed the ownership of the estate." "That's my home." He took a slow, deliberate breath before I answered. "Your home. I built that roof. I laid those floors with my own hands. I kept that land when the bank tried to take it away. You're living in what I bled for. You only ever had the keys because I trusted you with them." The silence on the other end of the line was heavier than any insult she could have thrown at me. Then she just muttered, "You had no right." I smiled softly to myself. I had every right. I just never used it. Until now. Before she hung up, that night, I sat by the window of my small farmhouse, the one she'd once called that old shack. Snow was falling softly outside, and a profound realization washed over me. Peace doesn't come from hurting the people who hurt you. It comes when you finally stop letting them define your worth. The sweetest revenge isn't watching them, but it's standing tall without them. A month later, news started spreading around town. They were calling it the old man's trust. It was funding local road repairs, providing farm supplies for struggling families, and even setting up a scholarship program for rural kids who wanted to go to college. I didn't do any interviews, didn't try to explain myself to anyone. I just let the results speak for themselves, and people noticed. They started to remember who I really was, the man who had given out jobs when times were tough, who never missed a Sunday meal at the town hall, who defix a neighbor's tractor for free when they couldn't afford the repairs. For years, my daughter had painted me as some relic of the past, a forgotten old man, but now the town saw me again, not as a poor old farmer, but as the backbone that never broke. Meanwhile, her reputation began to slip. She tried to pretend everything was fine, but in a small town, whispers travel faster than truth. Everyone knew what she'd done, how she'd humiliated her own father, how she'd tried to claim everything as hers. It wasn't gossip that destroyed her image. It was the sheer weight of her own arrogance. Sometimes, karma doesn't come knocking on your door. It simply lets the world see who you really are. Her friends stopped inviting her to gatherings. Her husband, Daniel, started spending more and more time away, drowning his own failures in a sea of excuses. Their finances thinned out. The lavish trips stopped. The credit cards started getting declined. And through all of it, she refused to look at the one person who could have saved her. Me. But then came the day when pride finally ran out of road. It was late February when she showed up at my farmhouse. The same daughter who once called this place a dump was now standing on its porch. Trembling in the cold, she looked smaller, somehow. The gloss of her confidence had been completely stripped away. When I opened the door, she didn't speak at first. She just stood there, holding herself like she was afraid I'd slam it right in her face. "Dad," she finally whispered, her voice barely audible. I'm sorry." I didn't answer right away. I let her words hang in the cold winter air. For a man who had once begged for a little respect, silence now felt like power. She continued, her voice cracking. "I was wrong. About everything. I was cruel and stupid and so proud. Daniel's gone. The house, it's not ours anymore, and I don't know where else to go." For a long moment, I just looked at her. My daughter, who once refused me food, was now asking for forgiveness and shelter. Life always finds a way to make us taste what we once served to others. I stepped aside and said quietly, "Come in." She cried, not polite tears, not the kind that come from embarrassment real tears, the kind that wash pride right off the face. She sat by the fire while I made tea, and I could see it in her eyes. She'd finally understood. Not through lectures, not through punishment, but through loss. Loss is a cruel but effective teacher. As I spoke, I learnt the truth. Her husband had left after their finances collapsed. Their investments failed, debts piled up, and their home was being repossessed. The same people she once bragged to had turned their backs on her. In her fall from grace, she'd finally seen what I always tried to teach her. Money can buy comfort, but it can never buy character. When arrogance finally breaks, it leaves room for wisdom to grow. That night, I let her sleep in the same guest room I'd been banished to. Funny how life turns its tables without asking for permission. I didn't gloat, didn't lecture, didn't remind her of what she'd done. Revenge doesn't need words. The silence of realization speaks louder than anger ever could. When she woke the next morning, I was already outside, working on the land. She watched me from the window, wrapped in one of her mother's old blankets. Later, she came outside, hesitantly, and picked up a shovel. "I want to help," she said softly, and for the first time in years, I smelled not from triumph, but from peace. Weeks passed, and something beautiful happened. She began to change. Slowly, genuinely. She worked beside me, learned how to plant, how to repair fences, how to be humble again. She started volunteering at the community fund, Vera Trust she had once mocked. People noticed her too. They stopped seeing her as the selfish woman who humiliated her father, and began seeing her as someone who was trying to make things right. I never mentioned the will, the money, or what she'd lost. I didn't need to. She was already gaining something far greater. A sense of purpose. Real revenge isn't taking what they have. It's watching them become who they never were. And as the snow melted into spring, I realized something even deeper. My revenge had never really been about payback. It was about redemption. Because sometimes, the person who betrays you isn't truly evil, they're just lost. And if your revenge helps them find their way back, then maybe justice and mercy can coexist. So I let her stay. Not as an apology, not out of pity, but as a chance, the same chance every broken soul deserves. And when she looked at me one evening, hands blistered from work, eyes raw from tears, and said, "Dad, thank you for not giving up on me," I knew the war was over. Spring turned into summer, and life settled into a rhythm calm, grounded and real. My daughter, once too proud to even lift a plate, now woke up before dawn to help me on the farm. She laughed again. She smiled without showing off. There was no luxury now, no shiny cars, no designer coats, just dirt under her nails and honesty in her eyes. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't living for appearances. She was living, but as peace returned to the land, I knew something she didn't. There was still one final chapter left to be written. Sometimes, the biggest lessons come wrapped in silence, waiting for the right moment to be opened. It was mid-July when I asked her to come with me into town. She hesitated. Maybe she thought I was taking her to sign some final paperwork for the farm, or maybe she was just nervous to face people again. Still, she came. We drove in silence until we reached the lawyeress office, the same one where she once stormed in years ago, demanding control over everything. When we stepped inside, Mr. Holden, my old attorney, smiled faintly. "You're right on time, Mr. Gray. Shall we begin?" My daughter frowned. "Begin what?" I gestured for her to sit, something long overdue. Mr. Holden pulled out a thick envelope, sealed in wax, the same one I had left untouched since the day I rewrote my will, the day after she denied me food on Christmas Eve. He placed it gently on the table and said, "This is the final version of your father's will." Her face went pale. "Final version." Tut, I interrupted softly. "You thought you already knew what I'd done." She sat still, hands trembling slightly, her eyes darting between me and the envelope. Mr. Holden broke the seal and began to read aloud. "To my daughter, Emily Gray, I leave not what she expects, but what she deserves. She already took everything once, not in money, but in spirit. And yet, despite her betrayal, she found her way back. So, to my daughter, who learned the true worth of a father's love the hard way, I leave the full rights to the Gray Foundation Trust. But it comes with one condition. She must continue its mission to help those in need, the same way she herself was once helped. If she does this faithfully for 5 years, every asset within the trust will become hers, not as an inheritance, but as earned redemption." When the lawyer, Mr. Holden, finished reading, the room fell completely silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Tears started welling up in Emily's eyes, but they weren't tears of greed or shock. They were tears of gratitude. "Dad," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You mean I still get everything?" I shook my head gently. "No, Emily. You don't get it. You earn it, just like I did, just like every honest person does." She covered her mouth with her hand and began to sob, the sound muffled but full of emotion. "I don't deserve this," she cried. I looked at her, my heart feeling both heavy with the past and incredibly proud of the present. "Maybe the old you didn't, but the woman who's been living here, working here, and helping others, she absolutely does. You see, revenge might satisfy the immediate pain, but it's redemption that truly heals the wound." For the next few minutes, she just couldn't stop crying. But it wasn't sadness anymore. It was a release. The kind of release that comes when you finally realize that forgiveness doesn't erase your mistakes. It just gives you the chance to outgrow them. I didn't say much during that time. I just let her feel it all. Because in that moment, she wasn't the cruel, entitled daughter who had once humiliated me. She was my little girl again, the one who used to hold my hand so tightly while we walked through these very same town streets. When we finally walked out of the lawyer's office, the warm summer sun hit her face. She managed a small, broken, but completely honest smile. "Dad," she said quietly, looking at me with newfound determination, "I'll make it right. Honortis, I promise." And for the first time in a very, very long time, I believed her. I realized then that true wealth isn't something that is passed down through wills and legal documents. It's passed down through lessons. The months that followed were a testament to her promise. Emily kept her word. She poured her heart and soul into the foundation, working tirelessly day in and day out. She slowly but surely rebuilt the trust she had lost with the community. She helped struggling families get back on their feet, offering them not just financial aid, but genuine compassion and support. It wasn't long before people in town started calling her the heart of Grey Trust. She never flaunted her past, and she never made excuses for it. She simply worked, letting her actions speak louder than any words ever could. One crisp autumn evening, we were sitting on the porch together, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. She turned to me, a thoughtful look on her face. "You know, Dad," she began, "I used to think revenge was all about getting even, about making someone feel the same pain they caused you. But you taught me it's about becoming better." I smiled softly, feeling a deep sense of peace wash over me. "That's the only kind that lasts, sweetheart." The following winter, she organized a community Christmas dinner. It was open to everyone, rich or poor, young or old. The very same holiday night that once haunted both of us with painful memories was transformed into something beautiful, something full of hope. As I looked around that bustling hall, filled with laughter, music, and a palpable sense of warmth and community, I realized that my revenge had come full circle. It hadn't resulted in destruction, as so many forms of revenge do. It had led to restoration. It was a powerful reminder that sometimes karma doesn't punish. Later that evening, Emily handed me a plate of food. Her hands were steady, and her eyes were full of a sincerity that I hadn't seen in years. "Dad," she said with a genuine smile, "you're the guest of honor tonight." And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I ate in peace. I was surrounded not by loneliness and regret, but by people, love, and a profound sense of purpose. That's when I finally understood the lesson life had been trying to teach me all along. You can lose your wealth, you can lose your home, you can even, for a time, lose your family. But if you never, ever lose your dignity, life always finds a way to return what truly matters. Thank you so much for joining me for this story. If it resonated with you, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel for more content like this. We'll see you in the next one.